Starting the bidding at $500. Do I hear six? $500 for the lot.
12 buyers stepped forward. 12 pairs of hands inspected her like damaged cargo, and 12 times they stepped back. The auctioneer's voice grew sharper with each failed bid. "A healthy slave sells for $800, he shouted, gesturing to another platform. That sale was finished in seconds. "A good horse, $50. Gone just as fast. Then there was Ruth. No one raised a hand. Her price fell. $100, $50, $10. Silence. Finally, a farmer laughed from the crowd. "I wouldn't take her for free," he called out. "She'll be dead before she reaches my land." Laughter followed. Not kind, not hesitant. The easy laughter of people certain of their place. Ruth did not react. Her body was thin. Her hands were twisted from years of labor. Her cough rattled quietly in her chest. She had buried 3 children with her own hands and learned not to cry aloud. But behind her eyes, something else lived.
Life Stories with the Innocent. Stories just for you. Ancient wisdom for modern lives.
Gather close, my people. I have a story to tell you. Not a story about magic or miracles, but a story about something far more powerful. A story about a woman who was sold for less than a sack of flour and who bought herself back with nothing but her mind. This is the story of Ruth Washington. And before I begin, I must tell you this. Some will say this story is impossible, that no slave could have done what Ruth did, that the numbers don't add up, that history doesn't work this way. To them I say, you are right. History doesn't work this way for most people. But Ruth Washington was not most people. This is her story, a legend born from truth, a folktale carved from suffering. Now, let us begin. The year was 1862. The place, a slave auction in Charleston, South Carolina. And standing on that auction block, barely able to stand, was a woman the world had decided was worthless. 12 buyers had examined her and turned away. The auctioneer, a man named Moses Hartwell, was growing desperate. He was a professional. He knew how to read a crowd. He knew how to spot value. And he knew with cold certainty that no one wanted this woman. She was thin, skeletal really. Her clothes hung on her like rags on a scarecrow. Her hands were twisted from years of labor. Her eyes were hollow, and at night, they said, she coughed blood into her pillow. The other slaves whispered about her. "That one's got 1 foot in the grave," they said. "She'll be dead before winter." Moses knew the market. A healthy slave could sell for $800, a strong field hand even more. A young woman with childbearing years ahead of her? 1,000, maybe 1,200. But Ruth? Moses started the bidding at $100. Silence. He dropped it to 50. A few men shifted uncomfortably, but no hands rose. $25, Moses called out. Nothing. $10. A cruel laugh rang out from the back of the crowd. I wouldn't take her for free, a farmer yelled. She'll die before she reaches my land. I'd lose money just feeding her corpse to the dogs. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Mean laughter. The kind that comes easy when you're looking at someone else's suffering. Moses was getting angry now. He had a reputation. He sold slaves efficiently. But this woman had been sitting in his holding pen for 2 months, eating his food, costing him money. $5, he shouted. Final offer. The crowd began to disperse. The auction was over. But here's what no one saw. While they were all looking at Ruth's broken body, Ruth was looking at them. She was counting. 12 buyers, 17 observers, 1 auctioneer. She was memorizing faces, recording prices, watching how men conducted business. Because Ruth Washington had learned something during her 8 years of slavery. When you have nothing, when you own nothing, when you are nothing in the eyes of the law, there is only one thing they cannot take from you: knowledge. And Ruth had been collecting knowledge like other people collect coins. She had watched her masters negotiate. She had memorized crop yields and market prices. She had calculated profit margins while her hands bled in the tobacco fields. She had turned suffering into study. And now, standing on that auction block priced at $5, she was still learning. She noticed the prices painted on the storefronts across the street. Flour, $2 for a 50-pound sack. Sugar, 15 cents a pound. Coffee, 20 cents a pound. She was worth less than 3 sacks of flour. She filed that information away. And then she heard a voice. I'll take her. The crowd turned. A man stepped forward from the back. Not a wealthy man. His clothes were worn. His boots were scuffed. His hat had seen better days. His name was Thomas Mitchell. Moses looked at him with suspicion mixed with relief. $2, Moses said. And even then you're throwing your money away. She won't last a week. The crowd laughed again. Thomas pulled 2 silver coins from his pocket, placed them in Moses's hand. Deal, Moses said. You just bought yourself a corpse, friend. Don't say I didn't warn you. As Ruth stepped down from the platform, her legs nearly gave out. But she didn't look at Thomas. She didn't look at Moses. She looked at the storefronts again, at the prices, at the goods in the windows, and she calculated. As they walked through the streets of Charleston, Thomas said nothing. Ruth said nothing. But both of them were thinking. Thomas was thinking, what have I done? I can barely feed myself. How will I feed her? Ruth was thinking, 6 months. That's all I need. 6 months to prove what I'm worth. But here's what neither of them knew. Behind them, watching them leave, was a man named Samuel Crow. Samuel owned the largest general store in Charleston. He was wealthy, respected, ruthless. And he had noticed something about Thomas Mitchell's failing shop recently. It had started to succeed. Just a little. Just enough to be noticeable. Samuel didn't like competition. And as he watched Thomas lead Ruth away, he smiled coldly. That fool just bought himself trouble, Samuel said to his assistant. But we'll see how long his luck lasts. Thomas led Ruth to his home. It was modest. A small house behind an even smaller general store. The store's shelves were half empty. The floor was dusty. The windows needed cleaning. This was a failing business run by a failing man. Thomas had been a widower for 2 years. His wife had died of fever, and with her, his will to succeed had died too. He opened the store because he had to. He ran it because there was nothing else to do. But his heart wasn't in it, and the numbers showed. He led Ruth to a small tool shed behind the house. Inside was a clean cot, a blanket, a pillow. Ruth stared at it, uncomprehending. You have one job, Thomas said quietly. Get well. You have to live first. He left her there, returned to the house, and came back with a bowl, hot oatmeal. Ruth stared at the bowl like it was made of gold. For 8 years, she had eaten scraps, rotten vegetables, moldy bread, things that weren't quite food but kept you alive anyway. This was the first hot meal she had seen in her memory. Her hands shook as she took the bowl. Thomas watched her for a moment. Then he left. That night, Ruth lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. She didn't sleep. She planned. 6 months, she whispered to herself. 6 months to prove I'm worth more than $2. 6 months to buy myself. The first week passed in a blur. Thomas brought Ruth 3 meals a day, hot food, real food. He didn't ask her to work. He didn't ask her to do anything. Just eat, he said. Just get well. Ruth's body responded like a plant after rain. The hollow look in her eyes began to fade. Her cough subsided. The color returned to her skin. But more importantly, her mind sharpened. While Thomas thought she was resting, Ruth was watching. Through the window of the shed, she could see into the store. She watched customers come and go. She observed their patterns. Morning customers bought coffee and bread. Midday customers bought tools and rope. Evening customers bought lamp oil and candles. But Thomas never seemed to have what they wanted when they wanted it. He stocked candles in summer when the days were long. He ran out of tools during planting season. He sold flour at the same price year-round, even though the price fluctuated wildly depending on harvest. Ruth watched, and she calculated. On the 8th day, Thomas left the store to make deliveries. Ruth, who had been growing stronger each day, stood up, walked to the store, and got to work. When Thomas returned 3 hours later, he opened the door to his shop and froze. Everything had changed. The goods that had been scattered randomly across shelves were now organized by category. Dry goods in one section, canned foods in another, tools grouped by size and function, seeds separated by season, and next to each section, there were small, handwritten notes. Thomas picked one up. His hands began to shake. Candles, 15% profit margin, currently stocked during summer when demand is lowest. Recommend reducing summer inventory by 60% and increasing winter inventory by 200%. Estimated additional profit, $40 per quarter. Thomas's mouth went dry. He picked up another note. Tools, 40% profit margin, currently running out during planting season March through May. Recommend increasing spring inventory and reducing fall inventory. Estimated additional profit, $75 per quarter. Thomas walked through his store in a daze, reading note after note. Every single one was accurate. Every single one showed a level of business understanding he didn't possess himself. And the handwriting. The handwriting was perfect, beautiful even. The kind of penmanship taught in expensive schools. Thomas's heart pounded. "Ruth!" he shouted. She appeared in the doorway, terrified. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I thought it might help. I'll put everything back. I'm sorry." Thomas stared at her. "How do you know about profit margins?" Ruth lowered her gaze. "I observe, sir. I always have." Thomas stepped closer. "Ruth," he said slowly, "can you read and write?" The color drained from Ruth's face. Reading and writing were illegal for slaves in most southern states. The punishment for a literate slave could range from amputation to death. "Please don't punish me, sir," Ruth whispered. "I learned in secret, watching the white children's lessons through windows, listening to merchants talk. I never meant to break the law." Thomas felt something break inside him. Here was a woman he had bought for $2, a woman the world had declared worthless, a woman who could barely stand a week ago, and she was correcting his business mistakes with the precision of a trained accountant. "Ruth," Thomas said quietly, "I'm not going to punish you." Ruth looked up, surprised. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly." She nodded. "Can you help me save my business?" Ruth stared at him for a long moment. Then she said 5 words that would change both their lives. "Yes, sir. I believe I can." Over the next 2 weeks, Ruth became Thomas's secret advisor. She didn't do it openly. That would have been dangerous. But every evening after the store closed, Thomas would sit with Ruth in the back room, and she would teach him. She explained how she had learned economics by watching plantation owners negotiate with merchants. She described how she had memorized crop yields and market prices by listening to conversations while she worked. She revealed that during her 8 years of enslavement, while her hands were destroying her body, her mind was building itself into something the world had never expected. A business genius in chains. Thomas listened, amazed. At Master Jefferson's plantation, Ruth said one evening, they lost 30% of their tobacco profits because they sold right after harvest when prices were lowest. If they had waited 2 months and sold during the shortage, they would have made double. "How do you remember all this?" Thomas asked. Ruth looked at him steadily. "When you have nothing, sir, knowledge is the only thing they can't take away. So I took everything I could, every number, every price, every negotiation. I saved it all up here," she tapped her temple. "Because I knew that someday if I survived, I would need it." Thomas tested her. He left complex invoices on his desk with deliberate errors. The next morning, every error was corrected, with explanations. He asked her to calculate profit margins for different scenarios. She did it in her head, faster than he could do it on paper. He presented her with supply chain problems. She solved them before he finished explaining them. After 2 weeks, Thomas called Ruth into his office. He closed the door. "Ruth," he said, "I need to be honest with you." She tensed. "You're not my property. You're my partner. You're smarter than me. You understand this business better than I ever will." Ruth said nothing. "I want to make you an offer," Thomas continued. "Help me fix this store. Really fix it. And I'll give you half of any extra profits we make." Ruth's eyes widened. "Half?" "Half," Thomas confirmed. "It's only fair." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I accept, but on one condition." "What condition?" "I want to buy my freedom." Thomas blinked. "You want a what?" Ruth leaned forward. "If you were selling a slave with my skills on the open market, what would you price them at?" Thomas thought about it. "Someone with your business knowledge, your literacy, your intelligence? At least $1,200. "Then that's our goal," Ruth said. "Give me 6 months. If I can help you make enough profit, I'll buy my freedom for $1,200. "Ruth," Thomas said gently, "I'll free you. You don't need to—" "No," Ruth interrupted. Her voice was firm. "I need to buy myself. I need the world to see that I earned my freedom, that I'm worth every cent of it." She looked at him steadily. "I was sold for $2. I want the record to show I bought myself for $1,200. Thomas stared at her. Then he extended his hand. "Partners?" Ruth shook it. "Partners." But what neither of them knew was that their conversation had been overheard. Samuel Crow's assistant, a man named Peters, had been watching Thomas's store for weeks, and he had seen Ruth in the back room, pointing at papers, making notes, teaching Thomas. Peters reported back to Samuel. That night, Samuel Crow sat in his office thinking, a slave running a business. It was illegal, it was unnatural, and it was working. Samuel smiled coldly. If he couldn't compete with Thomas's prices, he would destroy Thomas another way. Through the law. Ruth's plan was simple but brilliant. Phase 1. Cut costs. Instead of buying from local suppliers who charged high prices, they would buy directly from farmers and manufacturers. Phase 2. Plan by season. Stock tools before planting season. Blankets before winter. Candles before the days grew short. Phase 3. Offer credit. Let loyal customers buy on credit with a 10% convenience fee. Thomas was nervous. "Ruth, if anyone finds out you're running my business, then we don't tell them," Ruth said calmly. "I'll work in the back. You'll be the face. But the decisions are mine. Are you sure this will work?" Ruth looked at him. "Mr. Mitchell, you're losing 40% of your profits because you don't understand timing. I've been watching markets for 8 years. Trust me." Thomas took a deep breath. "All right, let's try." The first month, profits rose from $40 to $120, a 200% increase. Thomas stared at the ledger in disbelief. The second month, profits jumped to $240. Customers were returning. Word was spreading. The third month, profits reached $360. Thomas could finally pay off his debts. But success has a way of attracting attention, and Samuel Crow was watching. One afternoon, Samuel walked into Thomas's store. He looked around, noting the organization, the stock, the steady stream of customers. "Mitchell," Samuel said casually, "how are you suddenly undercutting my prices?" Thomas tried to keep his voice steady. "Just better sourcing," he said. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "And who's doing your books? I saw that slave woman in your back room yesterday. You letting property make business decisions?" Thomas's heart raced. "She just cleans," he said. Samuel stared at him for a long moment. "Be careful, Mitchell. People talk, and the law doesn't look kindly on slaves who forget their place." After Samuel left, Thomas found Ruth. "We have a problem," he said. Ruth listened as Thomas explained. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Mitchell, do you trust me?" "Yes." "Then trust me now. We can't use local suppliers anymore. Samuel controls too many of them. We need to go directly to the source." "The source?" "The farmers themselves." Over the next week, Ruth and Thomas traveled to farms outside Charleston. Ruth negotiated with farmers directly. She offered them better prices than the middlemen gave them. In return, she got lower prices than Samuel could offer. It was brilliant. The farmers got more money. Thomas and Ruth got cheaper goods. Everyone won, except Samuel. Within a month, Samuel noticed his suppliers selling to Thomas. He tried to block them, threatened them, offered them more money. But Ruth had built relationships. She had earned trust. The farmers chose her. Samuel's face turned red with rage. That's when he went to the sheriff. One morning, Sheriff Clayton walked into Thomas's store. "Morning, Mitchell," the sheriff said. "Sheriff," Thomas replied nervously, "I hear you got a slave doing your accounting." Thomas's mouth went dry. "She helps with inventory, that's all." The sheriff looked around the store. "The law says slaves can't conduct business," the sheriff said slowly. "If I find she's doing more than manual labor, I'll have to confiscate her." Thomas felt panic rising. "She's not conducting business, Sheriff. I am. She just helps." The sheriff nodded slowly. "See that it stays that way. I'd hate to have to take her away, especially since you only paid $2 for her." He tipped his hat and left. Thomas found Ruth in the back room. She was pale. "You heard?" She nodded. "Then we don't have much time," Ruth said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need to make enough money that I'm not your slave anymore." She looked at him steadily. "I need $1,200, and I need it fast." That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She had been calculating, planning, strategizing. The store profits were good, but not good enough. At the current rate, it would take 2 years to save $1,200. She didn't have 2 years. Samuel was watching. The sheriff was suspicious. She needed to move faster. And then she remembered something. 2 weeks earlier, she had made a delivery to the edge of town, near a Union military camp. She had noticed soldiers buying from local merchants, paying absurd prices. 50 cents for soap that cost 10 cents. $1 for tobacco that cost 20. $2 for homemade food. They were overpaying because they were desperate. Desperate men paid premium prices. The next morning, Ruth approached Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I have an idea." Thomas listened as she explained. When she finished, he shook his head. "That's risky, Ruth. The military doesn't like civilians in camps." "Then we don't go to the camps," Ruth said. "We set up outside. They'll come to us." Thomas hesitated. "If this fails, we lose everything." Ruth looked at him steadily. "And if we don't try, I stay a slave forever." Thomas took a deep breath. "All right, let's do it." They used their savings to buy a sturdy wagon and 2 horses. It was a huge investment. If this failed, they would be ruined. But Ruth had a plan. She didn't want to sell goods, she wanted to sell comfort. At 4 in the morning, Ruth began baking. Apple pies, fresh bread, cookies, stew, the kind of food that reminded soldiers of home. By dawn, the wagon was loaded. They drove to the edge of the military camp, set up 100 yards from the gates, and waited. At first, no soldiers came. Thomas started to panic. Ruth remained calm. "Wait," she said. Then, as the sun rose, a soldier noticed them. He walked over, smelled the pies. His eyes went wide. "How much?" he asked. $1, Ruth said. Thomas nearly choked. A pie that cost 20 cents to make, selling for $1? The soldier didn't hesitate. "I'll take 3, he said, "and give me 2 loaves of bread, too." Within an hour, a line had formed. By noon, they had sold everything. Total profit, $45. In one day. Thomas stared at the empty wagon in shock. Ruth smiled for the first time in 8 years. That evening, they counted the money. $45 in profit, Thomas said, amazed. Ruth was already calculating. "If we do this 3 times a week, that's $135 a week, over $500 a month." Thomas's eyes widened. "Plus store profits," Ruth continued. "We could have $1,200 in..." She paused, calculating. 5 months. Thomas looked at her. "You really think we can do this?" Ruth nodded. "I know we can." But what she didn't say was this. 5 months was a long time, and Samuel Crow wasn't going to wait 5 months. For the next 3 weeks, business exploded. The military market was even better than Ruth had predicted. Week 1, $400 profit. Week 2, $550. Week 3, $700. Thomas couldn't believe it, but Ruth wasn't celebrating. She was watching, because she had noticed something. A man had been asking questions at the military camp, asking who owned the wagon, who was running the operation, why a slave was handling money. That man worked for Samuel Crow. One morning, Ruth and Thomas arrived at their usual spot near the camp. But something was different. A military officer was waiting for them, with 2 soldiers. Thomas's heart sank. "Who owns this operation?" the officer asked. "I do, sir," Thomas said quickly. "She's just helping me load goods." The officer looked at Ruth, then back at Thomas. "I've been told your slave is conducting the transactions. That's illegal under military law. I could confiscate everything here as evidence." Ruth's heart stopped. If they lost the wagon and goods, they lost everything. "All sales go through me, sir," Thomas said firmly. "I give her the goods, she hands them to customers. That's all." The officer stared at them for a long moment. "Then make sure it stays that way. And get a commercial vendor permit, $50. I don't want to see you operating here without one." He walked away. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "That was Samuel's doing," Ruth whispered. "He's trying to shut us down." Thomas nodded grimly. "Then we'll have to be smarter than him." They paid the $50 and kept working. But Ruth knew the clock was ticking. Autumn arrived. The air grew cold, and Ruth saw an opportunity. "Winter is coming," she told Thomas. "Supply lines will freeze. Prices for firewood, blankets, and warm food will skyrocket. So we buy now while it's cheap and sell later when it's expensive." Thomas hesitated. "That's a big risk. What if winter comes late?" Ruth looked at him. "Mr. Mitchell, I've watched weather patterns for 8 years. I've seen how farmers predict harvests. Winter will come early this year, I'm certain." "How can you be certain?" "Because the geese are flying south 2 weeks early. Because the leaves are falling faster than usual. Because the farmers are already harvesting early." Thomas stared at her. Then he made a decision. "All right, let's do it." They spent nearly all their savings on winter supplies. Firewood, blankets, wool socks, warm clothing. If Ruth was wrong, they would be ruined. But Ruth was not wrong. Winter came early, and when it did, prices exploded. Firewood that cost 20 cents in autumn sold for $1 in winter. Blankets that cost 50 cents sold for $3. The first week of winter, they made $400 profit. The second week, $600. The third week, $800. By December, Ruth counted their savings. $1,150. She was $50 short. "One more trip," she told Thomas. "One more big sale and I'll have enough." But there was a problem. A massive snowstorm was coming. Everyone could see it. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon, wind picking up. Thomas shook his head. "We can't go out in this." Ruth looked at him steadily. "This is my last chance. If we wait, the season ends, the soldiers leave, and I'll never get another opportunity like this." Thomas stared at her. "Ruth, we could die out there." Ruth's voice was quiet but firm. "Mr. Mitchell, I've lived 8 years as property. I can survive one more storm." They loaded the wagon before dawn. The sky was dark. The wind was howling. Thomas had a terrible feeling about this, but they went anyway. Halfway to the camp, the storm hit. Snow fell so thick they couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The wind nearly overturned the wagon twice. The horse was struggling, stumbling in the deep snow. Thomas pulled the reins. "We're turning back," he shouted over the wind. "I won't risk both our lives." Ruth's voice was barely audible over the storm. "If we turn back, I lose everything. 9 months of work. My only chance." She looked at him. Not with defiance, but with desperate hope. "Mr. Mitchell, I know I have no right to ask this, but please, please don't make me go back to being worth $2. Thomas looked at her face, at the quiet determination in her eyes, at the woman who had transformed his failing business into a success, at the person who had been declared worthless and had proven the whole world wrong. He took a deep breath. "If we die out here," he said, "I'm blaming you in the afterlife." Ruth's lips twitched, the smallest hint of a smile. "Fair enough, sir." Thomas snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward into the blizzard. They traveled for 3 hours. The horse collapsed twice. Each time, Ruth got down and helped push the wagon while Thomas led the horse. Thomas's hands were numb. His face was frozen. He could barely feel his feet. "We're not going to make it!" he shouted. Ruth walked ahead of the wagon, breaking a path through the snow. "Just a little further, Mr. Mitchell," she called back. "Just a little further." And then, through the swirling snow, they saw lights. The military camp. They had made it. The soldiers were shocked to see them. "Who travels in this weather?" one asked. Ruth just smiled. "Someone who has something you need." She sold everything. Every pie, every blanket, every piece of firewood. The soldiers paid premium prices. By evening, the wagon was empty, and Ruth's leather satchel was full. They stayed at the camp overnight, waiting for the storm to pass. Ruth sat by the fire, counting money. Her hands shook, not from cold, but from certainty. $1,230. She had done it. The next morning, the storm had cleared. They drove back to Charleston in silence. Thomas kept glancing at Ruth. She sat perfectly still, clutching the leather satchel. When they arrived, Ruth asked Thomas to meet her in his office. She walked in carrying the satchel, set it on his desk, opened it. $1,200 in cash. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "I'd like to buy a slave." Thomas looked confused. "Which one, Ruth?" Ruth looked him straight in the eye. "Myself." Silence filled the room. Thomas stared at the money, then at Ruth. "Ruth, you don't have to pay me. I'll free you. You're my friend." Ruth's voice was firm. "No, Mr. Mitchell. I want to buy my freedom. I want it written in the official records that Ruth Washington paid for her own freedom." She paused. "I want the world to know that I'm worth every cent of this, that I earned it, that I'm not property someone gave away, but a person who bought herself." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He understood. This wasn't about money. It was about dignity. It was about proving to a world that had priced her at $2 that she was worth $1,200. It was about writing her own value. Thomas picked up a pen. His hands were shaking. "Then let's make it official," he said quietly. December 15th, 1862. In a lawyer's office in Charleston, South Carolina, a document was signed. "I, Thomas Mitchell, hereby sell the slave Ruth Washington to Ruth Washington for the sum of $1,200. She is now a free woman, with all rights and privileges thereto. Ruth signed her name at the bottom. For the first time in her life, her signature made her free. As they left the courthouse, Samuel Crow was waiting on the steps. He looked at Ruth with cold contempt. "Congratulations, Ruth," he said. "Now you're free to fail like the rest of us." Ruth looked at him calmly. "Mr. Crow," she said, "I was worth $2 in your eyes. I just proved I'm worth $1,200. She paused. "How much are you worth?" Samuel's face turned red, but Ruth had already walked past him. Free. The years that followed were not easy. Ruth tried to open her own store. Banks refused her loans. Suppliers wouldn't sell to her. Customers questioned whether a black woman could run a business. But Ruth had learned something during her years of enslavement. When the system won't let you through the front door, you find another way in. She found poor white men who were willing to lend their names to her businesses for a monthly fee. Officially, they owned the stores. In reality, Ruth controlled every cent. She built a network of 5 specialty stores across South Carolina, one for soldiers, one for farmers, one for women, one for general goods, one for wholesale. She created the South's first organized home delivery system, decades before it became common. She employed 40 people, black and white, and she became wealthy. Not Rockefeller wealthy, not Carnegie wealthy, but comfortable, secure, independent. In 1867, 5 years after buying her freedom, Ruth Washington sat in her office. She was 50 years old. On her desk was a framed document. Ruth Washington, purchased by herself, $1,200, December 15, 1862. A young woman came into her office. Her name was Amara. She was 17, newly freed, scared, lost. "Miss Washington," Amara said nervously, "I'm looking for work. I can clean. I can cook. I'll do anything." Ruth looked at her, saw herself at that age, saw the fear, the uncertainty, the desperation. "Sit down," Ruth said gently. Amara sat. Ruth leaned forward. "Let me tell you something, child. The world is going to tell you what you're worth. They're going to put a price on you based on your skin, your history, your circumstances." She tapped the framed document. "They told me I was worth $2. They were wrong." She looked at Amara steadily. "Don't let anyone else tell you your value. You decide that. You earn that. You prove that." "Can you teach me?" Amara whispered. Ruth smiled. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." And she did. Ruth Washington lived to be 73 years old. She taught dozens of young men and women how to build businesses, how to save money, how to navigate a world that didn't want them to succeed. She never married, never had children of her own. But she created a legacy that outlived her. When she died in 1885, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, black and white, rich and poor, people whose lives she had touched, taught, transformed. On her gravestone, they carved these words: Ruth Washington, born a slave, died free, worth far more than money could measure. And that, my people, is the story of Ruth Washington, the woman who was sold for $2 and bought herself for $1,200. But the real lesson of her story is not about the money. It's about this. The world will try to tell you what you're worth. The world will put a price on you based on things you cannot control. Your skin, your circumstances, your history. But you do not have to accept that price. You can decide your own value. You can prove it. You can earn it. You can demand it. And when you do, you write your own story. Ruth Washington was told she was worth nothing. She proved she was worth everything. Not because someone gave her freedom, but because she earned it. Dollar by dollar, day by day, with nothing but her mind, her will, and her refusal to accept the world's valuation. That is the power of knowing your worth. That is the power of refusing to be defined by others. That is the power of buying yourself. Go well, my people. Remember Ruth's story. And remember this: you are worth far more than anyone else can measure. The only question is, do you believe it?
Life Stories with the Innocent. Stories just for you. wisdom for modern.